Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Zona Bansky, and I'm the head of the Pacific Regional Office of the German Historical Institute, Washington, D.C., here at the University of California in Berkeley. It is my great pleasure to welcome you for this first lecture of our new GHI lecture series, Mobilities and Migrations Across the Americas. Today's event is the result of yet another wonderful cooperation with the Institute of European Studies, our long-term partner at UC Berkeley, which is co-hosting this lecture series together with the Center for Latin American Studies and the Berkeley Global International and Area Studies Initiative. I would also like to thank our partners in Mexico and Germany, the Maria Sabella Merian Center for Advanced Latin American Studies in Guadalajara and the International Training Group Temporalities of Future in Berlin. Here at the GHI, I would like to thank Heike Friedman for taking care of the logistics. Let me take this opportunity to thank my dear colleagues Albert Manke here in Berkeley and Mario Peters in Washington, D.C., the conveners who came up with the idea and concept for this lecture series and who will introduce today's speaker, Ramon Grosfoguel, and commentator Julia Roth, as well as the future events of this lecture series shortly. Thank you. Once again, welcome to the GHI's Pacific Regional Office, and thanks for making the trip to Berkeley to participate in this lecture. Albert and Mario, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sören. I really appreciate your kind introduction. Yeah, I would just briefly like to introduce Mario Peters, who is a research fellow at the German Historical Institute in Washington. And Mario and me are organizing this lecture series and would like to focus on inter-American entanglements, on mobility, both human mobility, infrastructures, and other types of mobility. And I, from a perspective of a specialist in Latin American history, inter-American studies, and trans-Pacific histories, would like to say that I'm really delighted that we can have this opportunity today and for the following 3 months to share the expertise that others will bring into these lecture series through their from their different fields. Mario, would you like to say something?
Yes, very quickly. Thank you, Albert. Thank you, Søren, for the kind introduction. As you said, I'm a research fellow at the GHI Washington, and I would also like to remind all and everyone in the audience that you are very welcome to write your questions to our speaker, Ramon Grosfoguel, into the question and answer section, which you can find on the bottom of your screen. And I pass the word right back to Albert, who will introduce our speaker.
Yes, thank you. Our speaker, Professor Ramon Crossfogle, is still having some technical issues to join us, but we hope that we will join us in just very brief amount of time. So I would like to introduce him already. He is originally from Puerto Rico, is a sociologist and professor of Chicano and Latino studies in the Department of Ethnic Studies here at the University of California in Berkeley, where also our Pacific Regional Office is based, as Søren Obansky already mentioned. He's internationally recognized for his work on racism and the decolonization of knowledge and power, as well as for his work in international migration and the political economy of the world system. He has been a research associate of the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris for many years. After obtaining his first degree in sociology in Puerto Rico, he moved to the United States, where he received both his MA in urban studies and his PhD in sociology at Temple University in Philadelphia. At Temple, he taught courses on race and ethnic relations in America, urban sociology, and international sociology. After concluding his PhD, he began teaching at Johns Hopkins University as a visiting professor and was awarded the Oraculum Award for Excellence in Teaching. He also taught at State University of New York, Binghamton, and at Boston College before accepting his current position at the University of California in Berkeley. Ramon Grosfoguel defines his thought as belonging to the decolonial current, surpassing the postcolonial current with which it is considered related. In this sense, he also argues that the effects of European colonialism did not cease with the process of decolonization and national independence of the 19th and 20th centuries, persisting in culture and ways of thinking. He proposes a decolonial turn to carry out an epistemological decolonization that includes a critique of racism and defends the idea of intersectionality of categories such as class and gender. Among his most important works are his book Colonial Subjects, Puerto Ricans in a Global Perspective, Unsettling Postcoloniality, and articles like La descolonización del conocimiento, the decolonization of knowledge, and Racismo epistémico, epistemological racism. In today's lecture, Professor Grosfoguel will address past and current problems in the history of mobilities, racialized ascriptions, inclusion and exclusion by bringing together his theoretical approach on racism and his work on international migration, focusing on Latin American migrants in the United States. While he will not primarily focus on the border between the United States and Mexico, his lecture will contribute to gain a better understanding of the underlying causes that lead to seemingly absurd situations like a white supremacist president of the United States that prioritizes visiting the US-Mexican border on one of the last days of his term, while at the same time more people are dying each day in this country from the pandemic than on September 11, 2001. Professor Grosfoguel, we feel deeply honored to have you here with us today, and thank you for accepting the challenge to bring together the two topics of racism and migration that, one might say, are of critical importance for situating current crises and dynamics of exclusion in the Americas and beyond.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I want to thank Albert and Mario for taking the initiative of organizing this series of lectures that are crucial for the understanding of migration processes as well as what's going on in many parts of what we call today the first world, you know, Europe and the USA. And in particular, USA, because the focus of the Mexican border question, as you know, is a north-south relationship there that in many ways have the legacies of colonialism present very strongly in those questions. Anyway, I just want to, we have only half an hour, so I'm going to basically go over. Oh, I also want to thank Julia Roth, who joined us also as discussant of this panel. And I want to thank her for accepting being part of the panel. Anyway, I just want to go very fast because I only have half an hour to do the presentation. Maybe in the question and answers, we can go in more detail about certain questions, but I will go very fast. Most of the things I'm going to be saying, you can find in articles of mine, as well as in videos. I have many videos also in YouTube that you can find. Some of these in my books, in many parts of my work. You can find most of what I'm going to be saying very fast here, without the nuances that you will be able to do if we will have more time. But let me first say I would like to begin with the concept of racism, and I want to begin there because it's a concept that we use very lightly in not only in academia but in the mainstream, you know. And people use the word racism, but people mean many different things when they use this term. Okay, so I want to clarify where I'm coming from, so that you understand at least where I'm coming from when I use the term, because I have the experience of presenting, doing presentations on these questions about migration, racism, and things like this. And the reaction sometimes is like shocking, because there are people who have understanding of the meaning of this concept that is quite different. So I might be using the word, and if I don't define it clearly, many people start, assuming that I'm saying something I'm not saying. So let me begin there. When I talk about racism, I am inspired by the Caribbean Fanonian philosophers, Fanon, Frantz Fanon. I'm inspired by the work of these Caribbean Fanonian philosophers because they are the ones who have further developed the work of Frantz Fanon, especially many things in the work of Frantz Fanon that were left implicit. As you know, Fanon died with 36 years old, very young, and he published 4 books during his life. And one of them, The Wretched of the Earth, is the book, together probably with the Bible, most read in planet Earth. So this is something that when you say this in an audience of the first world, people get shocked. But in fact, Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth is the book most read in the world. It has translations to I don't know how many languages, and have millions and millions and millions of editions of this book in many parts of the world. So he's a man from Martinique, a black man from Martinique, who joined Martinique, the colony of France in the Caribbean, and he joined the struggle of liberation of the Algerian people against French colonialism and French imperial domination of their country. And so inspired on the work of Fanon, and especially the Caribbean Fanonian philosophers, I try to develop a concept of racism that will be useful for the social sciences. First of all, let me begin by saying that if there is a consensus among scholars who work on questions of racism, is that racism is always structural, it's always systemic, it's never reduced to individual prejudice, individual stereotype. This is one of the mainstream definitions of racism, is that, well, these are crazy people with crazy ideas about other people. And that when you say that, you trivialize the significance and the magnitude of the problem. Because then if you're in Europe, you will say, well, the neo-Nazi, the extreme right. If you're in the USA, the Ku Klux Klan, and etc. But in fact, it's a more pervasive problem, because in fact, the problem, when it's structural, when it's systemic, when we're talking about institutional racism, it's not the question about stereotype or the question of prejudice. Is let's put it this way, is secondary in relation to the way the structures of the society work and the way they're deployed against certain population, giving privilege to a group of people, in this case, in the USA, for example, people classify as white people, and dispossessing and submitting to process of violence people who have been classified as inferior beings. So this is an institutional process that you could even have people in the institution that are not necessarily with prejudice or with stereotypes about other people, and still be practicing institutional racism. So that's how deep and pervasive this problem is, that you could have even people in the institutions who happen not to be racist in the sense of prejudice and stereotype, and still be doing, be part of the machine of institutional practices of racism. And this is where the problem is. The problem is not that there are a few people in the society have this crazy idea about other people. The problem is that the society itself is organized institutionally with racist, institutional, racist, structural practices. And this is where the problem becomes very, very significant and problematic, because then you have expressions of this in the economics of the society, where people are discriminated in the labor market, be that because they don't get jobs, or if they get a job, they are paid less, and so on, or submitted to the worst positions in the labor market, or the worst working conditions, or you have a situation where your rights, human rights, or even citizenship rights, because you could be a citizen of the country, but still with racism, you don't get in practice, you don't get the extension of those rights to you or to your community, but they're a constant violation of those rights in everyday life. And or you are discriminated in terms of a health system, or there's some educational system. There's so many areas where you see this pervasive process going on. Anyway, so that's one thing. The second thing I want to say very fast, there are more to say. I have many examples, but I don't have the time to offer you the examples of what I mean by saying that the problem is structural and not so much stereotypes or prejudice. And the second point I want to say is that when I say racism, I'm talking about multiple markers. That is, racism is one, but it has many markers. What I mean by markers in colonial history as well as today, you could see identity markers by the structures of racism that in some cases they use color, skin color. In other cases, they use religious identity, or they use ethnic identity, or, I mean, there are many markers that are part of the racist racist domination, or racial domination. And I'm saying this because one of the major mistakes we make when we are talking about racism is that we collapse the markers with the definition. So if you are born and you grow up in a society where color racism is the major marker, then if you go to other countries and you don't see color racism as the marker, then you think there's no racism there. And because you have collapsed the definition of racism with the marker. And that creates a lot of conceptual problems, political problems, all kinds of problems. And of course, anti-Black racism is one of the most pervasive and dominant forms of racism in the world today. I don't want to deny that, but it's not the only marker of racism in town. I mean, there are many other markers that have been deployed by colonial history and that have been deployed even today, where they're not just the question that could be marked not just by color, but also by religious identity, national identity, ethnic identity, the other markers. And the problem that we have today is that there is a huge confusion when you say racism and you don't see the color racism deployed. Then many people say, no, there's no racism. I mean, there's no racism because there's no color racism. But the definition of racism is not the marker. The marker is the effect of something else happening. And if you go to different parts of the world, you will see many different markers of racism. This is another statement I'm going to say now without being able to develop, but you could see my work and my videos. Racism is a modern problem. Racism was not there in previous civilizations before Western modernity and before European colonial expansion. There were problems in the past. I'm not romanticizing the past. There were ways to mark differences in the past, but racism as such, as a structural domination, did not exist. There were other forms of domination. There were other in previous civilizations. So I don't want to romanticize the past, but we need to be rigorous and historically bounded when we use terms. We cannot make of racism something that is there since Adam and Eve and make a transhistorical argument about racism. We need to historicize this. And I will say that 1492 is a moment, a little bit before or after, is an important moment of the constitution of what we call today racism. I mean, and especially it began, we could trace it back to the conquest of Al-Andalus in the south of Spain, you know, when the Castilian Christian monarchy conquered Al-Andalus. Then later on, you see this, a lot of this narrative deployed in the Americas with the colonization of the Americas in the 16th century, the conquest of Al-Andalus late 15th century, then the Americas 16th century against indigenous civilizations and people in the Americas. Then it went on into Africa with the massive kidnapping of Africans from the continent and brought by force to the Americas to be enslaved in the Americas. Then you have the massive killing of women accused of being witches all over Europe. I mean, I cannot go in detail about this, but there are all these genocides, epistemicide, I call them, you know, killing of people, and epistemicide, destruction of their knowledge structures that went on in the what I call the long 16th century, 1450, 1650, the formation of the modern world and the expansion, the European colonial expansion, and how this corresponds to the emergence of structural racism at a world scale, with particular manifestation in different regions, depending on colonial history, depending on many things that I cannot go in detail. And then, you know, so there are many markers that, you know, like for example, there could be religious markers, you know, there could be color markers, there could be ethnic markers, there are different markers. But then if racism have many markers, what is racism? And here is where I want to define it in a very concise way. I don't have the time to develop it, but basically then racism is a structural domination of superiority, inferiority along the line of the human. Whoever is classified above the line of the human are considered hyper-humanized. Superior beings that are hyper-humanized and become the norm of humanity, of what it means to be human. Whoever is classified below this line, then they are dehumanized. They are considered inferior beings. They are considered part of the closer to the animal world than to the human world, even though human beings were animals. But anyway, that's part of the anthropocentric view we have in Western-centric views of the world. But anyway, the point is that it's a process of inferiorization, and part of the narrative is to put them closer to the animal world than to the human world as part of the process of dehumanizing these populations. Now, there is in this superior-inferior structure of domination, whoever is above is considered superior, whoever is below is considered inferior, and then whoever is above belongs to something Fanon called the zone of being. Whoever is below belongs to something Fanon called the zone of non-being. What is this zone of being, zone of non-being? This is not a geography. This is a positionality in social space. So we're talking not about geography, spatial geography, but social space. And so I'm saying that because if you think about this geographically, then you fall into all kind of confusions. So the point is that zone of being means all the activities. You know, when the word of being there means all the activities of human social existence. That is the aesthetics, the epistemology, the way you organize political authority, the way you organize the economy, the forms of culture, the forms of everything that has to do with the human beings. That is the forms of social existence of humans. And so what he tried to say there is that racism is affects all the aspects of social existence. If you happen to be in the zone of being, in the zone of those classified superior, then your forms of good taste and beautiness, that is your concept of beautiness and good taste, that is the aesthetics, the forms of praying, that is your spirituality, the forms of thinking, your epistemology, the forms of political authority, that is the political structures, the forms of economy, everything that is related to human beings, even all the languages, are considered the superior ways of doing things. So there, and if you happen to be in the zone of non-being, the way you pray, the way you think, the way the concept of beautiness and good taste, that is your aesthetic, the concept of political authority or economy or whatever, is considered an inferior way of doing things. So this is the zone of being, zone of non-being. And so this, what Fanon is trying to say is that it's already very bad that in racist structures of domination, you're discriminated in your citizenship right or in your human rights. It's already very bad that you're discriminated in the economic activities. But on top of that, everything you do is put into a question mark. Like even your forms of aesthetic, even your forms of thinking, your epistemology, your spirituality, your culture, everything is going to put in question as an inferior way, barbarian way, uncivilized way of doing things. And so what Fanon is trying to address there is that racism covers all the activities of human existence. There is an aesthetic racism, there is economic racism, there is political racism, there is spiritual racism. There is, I mean, you go across the society and you will see the classification of human activities between the superior ways of doing things and the inferior barbarian ways of doing things. And so this is very important because it shows how deep and extensive the problem is. And so if you look at, so the zone of being, inside the zone of being is not a homogeneous space. Zone of being, there are conflicts, there are class, there are racial, there are class, there are gender, there's sexual conflicts. Even sometimes in some places, colonial, national colonial conflicts. If you look at Spain today, or you look at Canada, or you look there, also inside the zone of being, oppressions that are also national colonial oppressions. And then what is, so this is a heterogeneous space of conflict. So the main point I want to say there is that what is it then that defines or made these people to be all classified in the zone of non-being if this is a heterogeneous space? Well, because everybody living in the zone of being, they live, even those oppressed inside the zone of being, they live their oppression with racial privilege. That is, they live their oppression mitigated, please underline mitigated, by racial privilege. And those in the zone of non-being, they live the oppressions, they live the same oppression, class oppression, gender oppression, sexual oppression, racial colonial oppression, but they live it aggravated by racial domination. So look at, underline this, mitigated in the zone of being, aggravated in the zone of non-being. What does this aggravated and mitigated means? Well, this is related to the materiality of domination. In the zone of being, the way the system manages conflicts is through regulation and emancipation. Regulation meaning cause of law. because the humanity of the people oppressed in the zone of being by class, gender, sexuality, even national, colonial, or whatever, because their humanity is recognized by the dominant I, the masculinist, capitalist, heterosexual, imperial, colonial I. They recognize the humanity of the oppressed in the zone of being. Therefore, the methods they use to deal with conflicts are fundamentally peaceful means with exceptional moments of violence. Usually, they will implement a process of codes of law regulation and emancipation, like recognition of emancipatory discourses, okay? Like the right to equality, the right to liberty, the right to, the demands for equality, demands for liberty and freedom, demands for, all these demands are recognized, at least formally. And in the zone of being, the regulation means recognition of codes of law. So labor rights, civil rights, human rights, etc. When you are in the zone of non-being, the methods used by this dominant I is process of violence and dispossession. So violence and dispossession is the mechanism used by the system to handle conflicts in the zone of non-being. So again, zone of being, the methods the system uses regulation, emancipation. Therefore, if you are oppressed in the zone of being, you still leave those oppression with racial privilege, because the system is going to use mechanisms to deal with conflict that will give you some privilege, even if you're oppressed in that zone, compared to the zone of non-being. In the zone of non-being, the system will use violence and dispossession. Now, this has a lot of implications. And one of the implications has to do with the definition then. Now I go into the definition of racism. Racism is a structural domination of superiority, inferiority along the line of the human, where those classified as superior receive methods or material domination where their life becomes reproduced in more or less normal ways. In the zone of non-being, the system use methods of violence and dispossession where the life of the people in that zone are always at stake. That means that they live premature death, while in the other side, they live the reproduction of life. So with exceptional moments in the zone of being, the methods used are pacific, with exceptional moments of violence. In the zone of non-being, the normal is to use methods of violence with exceptional moments of peace. So it's like the inversion. I mean, so you could be a proletariat in the zone of being and a proletariat in the zone of non-being, and you're not living the same oppression. You're living completely different lives and experiences of oppression as a class oppression. If you're a woman in the zone of being or a woman in the zone of being, you're living also very different forms of patriarchal oppression, because one is mitigated by racial privilege, the other side is aggravated by racial domination. So what racial domination does is that through methods of pacific methods or violent methods, it affects in significant way the life of people in both zones, and one with privilege, the other one with devastation in their lives in a dramatic way. And then you have here a situation where while in one zone you have what Foucault called biopolitics, that is the management of population and the reproduction of life. In the other zone, you have thanatopolitics, that is the politics of death that usually leads you to premature death. Premature death can arrive to you in the zone of non-being because you were walking down the street, the police stopped you and killed you. And this is very dramatic in many parts of the world today, including the USA, where the people classified in the zone of non-being are constantly submitted to process of violence to the point that their life is every day at stake. They could be killed anytime by the police or, whatever, the repressive forces of the state. And, or it could arrive to you through not lack of access to health system, or it could arrive to you through living in a community that is submitted to environmental racism, that you are submitted to all this contamination from a city or from a region in a country, because the lives of these people are disposable. They're considered zone of non-being, they're considered inferior, dehumanized, therefore the system basically goes over this thing. So anyway, so this is what I'm talking about when I talk about racism. I'm talking about a structure that produces life in one zone and death in the other. So this is now, in terms of migration studies, I have developed a theory related to this question that will help us to address the question of international migration theory, all of that, putting at the center this question about coloniality and racism. This question of that I've been describing here as the racial domination. When populations from the South, for example, they enter the space of Europe or the USA, what happened is the following. You have, on the one hand, inside those spaces are not a neutral space. There are all these histories that precede the arrival of the migrants that have to do with a history of racism inside that space. So for example, in the case of the USA, you have what I call the colonial racial subjects of the US empire. These are people who are in the USA not because they migrated, but because the empire came to them and colonized them. So you have indigenous people, for example, or you have African-American people who came, kidnapped from Africa and brought to the Americas by force. You have Latino populations, such as Mexican Americans, who were part of a conquest of northern Mexico in the 19th century, or you have Puerto Ricans, or you have Pacific Islanders, or you have Filipinos that are all there in the USA as part of colonial history. And I'm saying this because the significance and importance of what I call colonial racial subjects of empire for migration studies is fundamental. It have nothing to do with demographic. They could be demographically small numbers. It's the significance they have for racial discourses in that space. So a lot of the imaginary and the structures of domination, of racial domination in a place like USA are produced in relation to the colonial racial subject of the empire, to those that the US colonized directly. So a lot of the imaginary of white America is constituted by this history and by the structural domination along the lines of anti-Black racism, anti-Mexican racism, anti-Puerto Rican racism, anti-indigenous racism, all this stuff, okay? And, but what happened is that then migrants who arrive to the USA, they don't arrive to a tabula rasa, to a neutral space. They arrive to a space that is already polluted by this history of racism vis-a-vis the racial colonial subject of empire. So what happened in the USA is what I call, I classify most of these populations coming from the global South that arrived last night or a week ago or a month ago or several years ago as colonial migrants. Why I call them colonial migrants? Because when they arrive to the USA, they're immediately classified like the colonial racial subjects that have been there for centuries in the USA. For example, I'm talking about the Mexican Americanization of Salvadorians, Guatemalans in Los Angeles, or the Puerto Ricanization of Dominicans in New York, or the African Americanization of Haitians in Florida. I mean, what happened is that they arrive, and when they arrive, they're immediately classified in relation to some of the colonial racial subjects that were there before. So for many white Americans, for example, Salvador or Guatemala is just a town in Mexico, and they just extrapolate everything, all the structures of domination put in place in LA vis-a-vis Mexican Americans or Chicanos, like we say in our Latino Chicano studies. The racial colonial subjects, they are the ones that have been here for centuries, and therefore a lot of the structures of racial domination are developed and put in place in relation to those subjects. So what happened many times is that the migrants coming from the global south are immediately classified in relation to one of these colonial racial subjects. This is what I call the colonial migrants. They are migrants. They were never directly colonized by the USA, but when they arrived to the USA, they lived the life of racial domination of the racial colonial subject, even though they never experienced a direct colonial domination from the USA. And this is what I distinguish between racial colonial subjects and colonial migrants, okay? And then there is a third experience of incorporation to the USA, which are migrants who arrive to the USA and are classified like the whites in the USA that live racial privilege because they're immediately classified as whites. That's happened not only, I mean, with many European migrants coming from Europe to the USA, especially Northern European migrants, because including Spaniards or Portuguese, many times they arrive to the USA and they're classified as Latinos. That is, they're immediately leaving the racism against Latinos in the USA. Many of them very surprised because they thought of themselves as being white, and in their home countries, they are white, but when they come to the USA, they're not perceived as white, they're perceived as Latinos, and then they leave the oppression, the racial oppression Latinos live in this country. And then you have, so you have many migrants, including Latinos, coming to the USA that are classified, and this is a small number of the Latinos, not the majority, that are classified as whites in the USA and live the racial privilege of whiteness in the USA. So I'm saying this because we cannot continue in migration studies using terms like, you know, thinking that, okay, Latino migration, they are all living racial oppression. Well, the majority are living it, but there's always a small number of them that are incorporated as part of whiteness in the USA. And the same thing happened with migrants from many parts of the world, that when they arrive here, some of them, even if they're not skin color white, they're incorporated as honorary whites. That's a term used back in the 60s and 70s to talk about the Japanese transnational managers who were coming to the USA, to the multinational Japanese companies who were here producing cars and other items. And so there was this term used, honorary whites, that was used also in South Africa for Japanese executive transnational corporation managers. And this term has been used and extrapolated also for other types of migrants coming from the global south that are classified as honorary white, even if they're not in terms of skin color white. And so this creates a complexity now, what I'm describing to you, that we cannot use essentialize anymore using these terms like migrant or like Latino or Asian, or, I mean, these terms, we need to cut them across into colonial racial subject of empire, colonial migrants, and those who are incorporated as white, as part of whiteness, or honorary whites. So this is very important for migration studies. And of course, if you bring in other categories, like the question about how you racially classify, and then the question of gender, sexuality, class, another question, then the whole thing becomes very complex, because now you're going to have a picture that is very, very complex, very heterogeneous. And I was providing this conceptual mapping so that we have a significant discussion about international migration. So before we discuss content and experience, it's important to clarify certain concepts and certain categories, okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ramon. I really appreciate and your incredible knowledge and disposition to share with us. And it's really a pity that we are such on such a short time frame. But I just wanted to let everybody know that we will first have Julia Roth's comment, and then afterwards we'll start with a Q&A, okay? So let me just briefly introduce Professor Roth. Julia Roth is a professor for American Studies with a focus on gender studies and inter-American studies at Bielefeld University in Germany, where she's also a member of the Center for Inter-American Studies. Prior to this position, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the research project, The Americas as Space of Entanglements, also at Bielefeld University, and at the interdisciplinary network Desigualdades, Interdependent Inequalities in Latin America at the Freie Universität Berlin, as well as a lecturer at Humboldt University in Berlin, the University of Potsdam, and the Universidad de Guadalajara in Mexico. She's currently the coordinator of the research group Global Contestations of Women's and Gender Rights at the Center for Interdisciplinary Research at Bielefeld University. Her research focuses on postcolonial, decolonial, and gender approaches, intersectionality and global inequalities, as well as anti-racist feminist knowledge from the Caribbean and the Americas, but also on recent intersectional feminist movements opposing right-wing populism. Alongside her academic work, she organizes and curates cultural political events like the theater festival Women Images of the Americas in Movement in Berlin, and BPOP, Black Europe Body Politics, with Eleanor Lockwood, the Deheimatized Belonging at Gorky Theater Berlin. Her most recent publications are Right-Wing Populism and Gender, European Perspectives and Beyond, Can Feminism Trump Populism? Right-Wing Trends and Intersectional Contestations in the Americas, Women on the Fast Track, Coloniality of Citizenship and Embodied Social Mobility, together with Manuela Huatka, and Feminism Otherwise, Intersectionality Beyond Occidentalism. Julia Roth, we feel very honored to have you with us today and deeply appreciate that you accepted our invitation to comment on Ramon Grosfoguel's fascinating lecture. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Albert. The honor is all mine. I'm delighted and very excited to take this difficult task to reply to Ramon, since he always makes you think and it's hard to immediately reply. Also, thank you very much to the GHI. It's good to be back. I have very good memories of the workshop 2 years ago when traveling was still possible. And also it's good to see you again, Ramon, after quite a while. So to not sort of waste more time, Ramon, your lecture, as always, was very fascinating and trailblazing, as your work is. And thank you for pointing once again, or so emphatically, on the structural dimension of racism, but also its foundational role for modernity and capitalism. So actually, what many see as just maybe minor contradictions or side effects as very sort of fundamental. Also, as historical, you historicized it in 1492 as an important moment from which on we have this structure and want to be historicized that is also all-encompassing, but at the same time, as you pointed out towards the end of your input, also context specific. And I think this makes it all the more complex, but also at the same time useful for migration studies and whatever other people are also doing. Thank you also, thank you. I also very much appreciate you referring to Fanonian Caribbean thinkers and Fanon himself, and his useful thinking along the line of humanness and belonging to this category or not, which is deeply, I think, embedded in Western thinking, in Occidentalist thinking, and the zones of being and non-being, I think, and life and death accordingly, as you pointed out. Also, that this is a social space, not geographically, to be geographically distinguished. And I think this is helpful for the work of many to also understand, of course, as you mentioned with your examples in the end, that of course this can apply to very different subjects' positions in different geographical spaces. So it's not global south, global north, the west, the rest, and necessarily referring to particular countries, but rather to these positionalities or these social spaces, as you call them. And I think this is something very helpful for this sort of research that I think many in this context are also engaged in. Also to see that migrant communities are sort of often positioned along these racist, racialized lines. You also mentioned intersectionality, but for later, I have a question regarding to that. So I mentioned this already. One question, maybe a provocative one, since we also want to discuss, and it's something since world systems theory and decolonial thinking is somewhat related to a Marxist thinking, not wanting to say that it's stemming from this Eurocentric concept, but it has much in common with questioning power structures. But sometimes I feel like here race is sort of put center stage, and with a reason, but is it sort of how can we avoid, since as Albert mentioned, I'm interested in an intersectional perspective, that racism becomes just sort of the main contradiction, the Hauptwiderspruch, in a similar way that class is in classical Marxism. And gender often just an add-on, or since you mentioned it, that there are different axes of domination always at work. But I think conceptually speaking, I often miss in these schools, like, I mean, there were interventions by amazing scholars like Maria Lugones or Catherine Walsh and many others. They're often mentioned, but sometimes this work is sort of left to the women. They're often not even quoted. So how can we deal with that in order to become more intersectional, also structurally and theoretically speaking? Without, I don't have to use the term intersectionality. I think it's useful, but you know what I mean. Exactly. And then I think of great interest to many who do actual research in the context of the German Historical Institute, how can we relate these wonderful concepts to concrete cases and research projects. You probably have more experience with that with your students, how to apply it to concrete spaces. We also thought when we prepared this talk, to for example, European settings, current settings, and lastly, maybe that for being able to soon enter into the discussion, I looked at your 2007 text again, Latinos, Latinas y la descolonización del imperio estadounidense en el siglo XXI. And I was fascinated how timely this text is now, like 13 years later, because, and so I would be interested, what outlook would you now draw to this current moment, I think, where things have just sort of polarized even more? I mean, they're not new, but I think they have organized in a new way, and the role of Latinos and the, so very interesting and topical, I think, perspective you already pointed out in this text, and what you think, what would be your outlook with regards to future developments of capitalism and the colonial structures embedded therein that you already did there. And lastly, I would like to, in the discussion, you don't have to answer all these points, where do you see moments of or possibilities of resistance? I mean, that are sort of, I think, already inscribed in many of the practices by migrant populations and colonized populations and bodies in many spaces, but very concretely, and maybe at the current moment also, I think we often have very, if you want to call them dialectical or structures also going on. But thank you so much, and I'm really excited to know more what you think about these points also.
Thank you so much, Julia, for your very enlightening comment. And I would briefly like Ramon to answer before we blend over into the general discussion.
Yes, great. I mean, Julia, thank you very much. I think this is, I mean, fantastic comments and critical questions. I first of all, of course, there is some, if you look at my, I mean, I was rushing in my presentation given the limits of time, but I was talking in my definition of racism about the intersectionalities of zone of being and intersectionality in zone of non-being. I was taking in the intersectionality of oppression in both zones. But there, what I always say when I present it, I mean, in the zone of being, there are oppressions that are gender, sexual, class, etc. In the zone of non-being too. But what I was trying to do with this is try to understand how these oppressions are lived differentially in each zone. So I would say there is, to use the term intersectionality, or you could use multiple oppression or interlocking. I would say these oppressions are entangled. They are not like additive or something that you add. They are entangled. And I have always used in my work the concept of entanglement, because I don't like this additive thing as if each oppression was autonomous from each other and you just add one after the other. This concept of intersectionality, now talking about German studies, it's very Weberian, that like they separate the oppressions as autonomous spheres. And I find it very problematic, because that's not how in real social historical context these oppressions are lived. What you have is an entanglement of oppressions, and that's how people live these oppressions. And so when you look at the entanglement, the racial factor, when I say race, I use a meta theory that is very different from the Weberian theory and from the Marxist theory. I have other works of mine on that topic. My meta theory is closer to the interlocking of the Black feminist. Okay, the concept of interlocking. That is the entanglement of the oppressions. The concept I use is not that there is, like the Marxists, they will put the last instance is economics and everything else is determined by that, right? I'm talking about an entanglement of multiple hierarchies in a historical context. So I'm not putting that one, what happened with Marxism, but also with some Weberians with the concept of culture, is that they reduce everything to one thing: culture or the economy. This is the debate, right? Now, the meta theory of economy or culture determining the rest is like making the other oppressions epiphenomenon. And I have problem with that. I prefer to use heterarchy as a concept, heterarchical structure, like a multiplicity of hierarchies of domination entangled to each other, which means that one oppression cannot determine the others in the sense of making the other epiphenomenon of this one, like happened with Marxist meta theory. Some Marxists, okay, or some of the more orthodox Marxists who make the economy the determination in the last instance, and the rest is just a epiphenomenon of class, right? I don't want to do with race the same thing, but I'm glad you asked this, you made this critical comment, because it allowed me or give me the opportunity to clarify that I'm using a concept of heterarchy, not a concept of hierarchy. I'm more closer to the heterogeneous historical structures of Latin American scholars who have coined this term, heterogeneous historical structures, to precisely distance themselves from this Eurocentric last instance that determine everything view, be that Weberian, be that Marxist, be that whatever, and so we are, I think gender oppression, I mean, the patriarchal system is a structure that you cannot reduce to anything else. But at the same time, you cannot understand it without the entanglement of patriarchal domination with other hierarchies of domination, like class, like race, like other things, So what I was trying to do in my definition of racism is to entangle all these oppressions and showing how this racial domination affects the other oppressions, not in the sense that the other oppressions are just a phenomenon of race, like the Marxists would do with class, but in the sense that in a hierarchical concept of complexity theory of multiplicity of hierarchies of power entangled to each other, then we need to see how they entangle to each other. And this is how I think they race entangle with patriarchy. That is that it splits the domination, the sexual gender domination in two sides that are living a patriarchal oppression, but they're living in very different ways because of how race comes in and complicates the way gender sexual oppression live. For example, women in the zone of non-being or LGBT people in the zone of non-being live are submitted to process of violence that are way more devastating than process of violence that you see in the zone of being. You know, not that there's no violence in the zone of being. It's just we're talking about a qualitative difference in the way these oppressions are lived. That's what I'm talking about. And then I think I don't think I have time right now to cover the other two questions, no?
Well, there is actually a question from the audience that really ties very well into what you're just saying. I will not go over in the order that we received questions, but would like to add this one because it really ties into it. First, I want to welcome all the participants from so many different countries and many of them who we know from other contexts. Thank you for joining us. So this question comes from Richard Wetzel at the GHI in Washington. He says, I appreciate your point that racism can have multiple markers other than skin colors, such as religious or national identity, but I gather that you don't include gender, class, or sexuality among those multiple markers, but consider discrimination based on gender, class, sexuality as different in kind from racism. I think you already embarked on that a bit. So he asks, could you comment on why discrimination based on gender, sexuality, etc., is different in kind from racism, and also what are the boundaries of the multiple markers for racism?
Yeah, I mean, this is related to what I was just talking, but the main issue is that when you talk about gender, I mean, we could invert the question. I was talking about trying to define racism to understand migration studies. I was talking about how race complicates class oppression, gender oppression, etc. But we could do it the other way around. We could bring how patriarchy complicates racial domination. And then you're going to see in the zone of non-being conflicts inside the communities that are classified as dehumanized people in the zone of non-being, where you have, sexist, homophobic, whatever conflicts coming out of patriarchal domination inside that zone. You see, so that's what I'm saying. These zones are not homogeneous; they are heterogeneous. But what we need to do is break away from the understanding of intersectionality as additive oppressions, like Julia was saying, and start bringing the interlocking, the imbrications, the entanglements between all these oppressions to situate them in concrete historical context. That is, all the theoretical mapping I'm providing here is just that, a mapping that once you go to the terrain and once you are then it gets complicated. You need to, that's just like a tool that I found useful when doing research to then when I'm on the ground, you could see the complexities because you're going to see then how all these things are entangled in a way that, for example, inside the zone of non-being, for example, LGBT people could be in the worst position, okay, in certain contexts, okay? Between all the people that are in the worst position, that is who are inferiorized, dehumanized, submitted to process of dispossession of violence, then you see the LGBT people in those zone of being community being in the worst situation. So suddenly you start complicating the map and seeing how all these oppressions entangle to each other and not denying at all the reality of all these structures of domination. I am acknowledging them. I'm just saying you cannot understand them if you keep separating them as if they were spheres of reality, like Habermas will say, autonomous fields. I just don't see it that way. I think we need to entangle these things and come with more complex and interlocking intersectionality, or the way you want to call it. But this is part of what in the literature of coloniality we've been working with. We've been working a long time ago with these concepts of the entanglement of multiple oppressions. And so this is, which means that no, you cannot take one as the determination in the last instance, okay? Okay, so this is, I don't know, let me know whenever I have a few time to answer a few of the other questions of Julia, but let's keep going. See if there are other questions that relate to them.
Okay, yeah. Well, there's a more general question from Laura Moore, who asks, how can we embrace diversity without making any kind of differentiation between people? How can we walk toward oneness of humanity? And she, from a position as being a teacher, she asks, how can I share or teach that experience of oneness with all nature as beings? And I think this also is kind of the question concerning differentiation between people also ties into what Milena Risotti is asking, who's asking about deserving migrants, the category of deserving migrants versus non-deserving migrants. For example, those who are not granted with asylum and as such deportable. So the question about zone of being and non-being is coming up here. And also I want to tie in a third question, also touching about zone, from Nancy Al-Hachem, about colonial migrants and zone being, can the same theory or approach be applied on different spaces? For example, Arab or Turkish migrants in Europe, or does each continent have a so-called racism of their own?
Yeah, well, first of all, that's why at the beginning I was saying that this is not a geography, because racism after the European colonial expansion, colonization of the world, after the destruction of other civilizations during the European colonial expansion, and now we are in a planetary civilization that is this Western modernity civilization. Nobody's outside that. It doesn't matter if you're in China or wherever. We are all within this one, because all the previous civilizations were destroyed by the European colonial expansion. So we have racism everywhere. The problem is that racism, the markers are not going to be the same. The way racism as a structure of domination, the way I describe, is everywhere. And you could have westernized elites in Africa with a black face that are practicing racism against other populations in their country, because this is a heritage of colonial history. This is something that goes back to the European colonial expansion and has been internalized not only in our subjectivities, our imagination, but also in the structures of domination of the modern world. It's everywhere. So I don't want to make some kind of exceptionalism, like only Western countries have racist, the problem of racism. Problem of racism is everywhere in the world today. This is a global problem. And so I want to break away from the idea of zone of being as a geography. This is not a geography. This is a relation of racial domination in the social space of different parts of the world. Now, how this is marked, in some places you will have color racism. There are other places like in Africa today where color racism doesn't work. And it doesn't work because everybody has the same skin color, more or less. So what's the point of using color racism? They use other markers, religious identity, ethnic tribal identity, and so on. And usually the colonizers left in power those ethnic groups that were privileged during colonial times. They were left in power during the transition to independence. So these groups were always privileged in colonial time and now are the ones running the show in many countries in the third world today. And if you look to Latin America, they're the white Creole elites, the descendants of the Spaniards and the Portuguese running the show in Latin America. I mean, so you go around the world, you see many manifestations. So for me, the concept of West and the rest is not a geography, as very well put by Julia, but it's a relations of domination in power, in the social space of racial domination. And you could have whoever is classified the West in a country could be someone with a black face, could be someone with a brown face. If you look at India today, Hindi fundamentalism and the Hindi elites, they are the westernized elites. They are practicing racism against Muslims, against Tamil people, against other people that are identified not on the base of color, because everybody more or less share the same color skin. They use other markers. It's the same as the British in Ireland. The British in Ireland, over many centuries, they practiced racism against the Irish people, but they couldn't use color racism, because in Ireland, probably the Irish are whiter in color skin than the British, So the color racism didn't work. What did they use? They used religious identity, the Protestant and the Christians, but they were practicing process of dispossession and violence against Irish people in the classical way as I'm defining racism. So you cannot say that because they were white, there was no racism there, because they were marked in terms of religious identity. The Catholics vis-a-vis the Protestants. Those markers,
thank you.
In that context, just a second, Albert, give me a second. I know there is a hurry. I will finish in 30 seconds. Those markers are very important to understand how the marker of race and racism could be very differently. And you could have white people, quote unquote, people with skin color white, that could be living racism in certain contexts. You see, that's why I'm trying to make it more complex, okay? Now, I'm not saying in most of the world today, given white supremacy, given the system of imperialism, white supremacy, European colonial expansion, most people with white skin, the great majority, live racial privilege in most part of the world today. I'm not denying that, but there are exceptions to the rule that are very interesting from the point of view of the definition of racism I'm making here. So, for example, Islamophobia in Europe today or in the USA is not a form of religious discrimination. This is a racist discrimination. Because in this context, this is not that there is a religious, it's that they are submitting Muslim population to process of violence and dispossession. And they're being classified as these barbarian, uncivilized people, etc. And submitting to them all these regimes of policing that are a process of violence and dispossession of these communities in the West today. So anyway.
Oh, yeah, wonderful. I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but it's such a fascinating discussion, and we have so many questions. So I'm just trying to bundle them. So there's actually a question towards Julia Roth as well about gender issues. If she could develop a bit more into this direction. And Anne Titor, who thanks you for the lecture and asks how racism itself and the zones of being and non-being change over time, and what's the driver of the change, and if social movements should try to include more people into the zone of being or try to overcome the existence of zones. And I would like to add the question by Jochen Kemner, who also is questioning this bipolar structure and asks about what about fluidity and the changes of this positioning in the structure. If we think about migration as a tool to overcome supposed fixed racial positions in both directions, and how you integrate ideas of belonging and description in your theoretical work. That last one is for Ramon, but let's first go to Julia first.
Okay, I'm still, my mic's still on. Yes, thanks. Very, very important and good questions. Maybe quick to gender, that's a good link also to my reply to Ramon. I couldn't agree more, Ramon, and I think we have to exchange work more, because that's exactly my take on intersectionality too, as I have elaborated on it, trying to see it not as an additive concept, which it never was intended to be, but other concepts were. and therefore, I also more about gender. Yeah, I mean, I think to reduce gender to patriarchy is a bit reductionist, since patriarchy would be an all-encompassing sort of structure of domination. And Maria Lugones has shown us that the colonial racist gender system also produced very different gender positions, sort of depending on different factors, and that we have to be very careful. And sometimes gender might be the more important form of course, oppression. In other moments, it's more citizenship status, or of course racist oppression or other oppressions. So to really sort of see oppressions articulating in and through one another, and that this is complicated. And I think we have to look at concrete cases. So start from the material, but just have this lens, like your colonial racist modern world system, sort of thinking that you, as one of the few, also always sort of broaden towards heteropatriarchal and so on and so forth, which I really appreciate. But I think that's the lens that helps us to see that gender is not another dimension of oppression, but it's in it. I mean, you're differently gendered when you're, whether you're white or non-white, to simplify, and the other way around, you're also, I think, racialized differently according to how your gender position is read, or how you're positioned along these lines. So it's even more complicated, but that's about it.
Yes, I completely agree. This is exactly what I'm trying to say. Maybe I'm not explaining myself, with clarity, but this is exactly it. That when I say patriarchy, I'm talking about a system of domination, okay? But in reality, in the concrete reality, you have, gender, sexuality that are part of the production of a system of patriarchy that I call it Christendom patriarchy. That's another discussion, because it's not just patriarchy, it's that it has a very, very particular form of patriarchy that was globalized with the European colonial expansion, and that are now with us in most of the world today. That this form of patriarchy was the one globalized. And now this question of gender is not that it exists over there in patriarchy. No, it's there in citizenship rights. It's there constituting our policies, state policies. It's constitutive of everything, So I am not thinking, I'm thinking of this like for example, if you say the system, the colonial system of domination where racism becomes a central aspect, it's not that the colonial system of domination is over there in a corner. It's that it's constitutive of everything we're doing. So in that sense, I agree with you that we can identify, the structural system of domination from where these things are coming from, but in the concrete reality, these things cross over in many aspects of socialist system and social life. So you cannot think that patriarchy is over there and colonialism over there and capitalism over there. Is that these things and entangle? And when I use the term entangle, it's precisely in the way you're describing. That is that gender is there organizing citizenship rights, public policy, the labor market, how much you earn in the labor market, etc. So it's like these are organizing logics of the system we live today. Okay, race, gender, sexuality, all these things comes in and organizes in complex ways the world we live. So I completely agree with your point. In terms of the question of diversity, I am very skeptical with the term diversity when it's used in the absence of social justice, or is used in the absence of, I'm not talking about Julia, I'm talking about someone who raised that question before. I'm skeptical of the use of this term diversity in the absence of social justice, because it has become, at least I can tell you about the USA, but I can see that happening in France and in other parts of Europe, where diversity becomes liberal multiculturalism. And I think this is very important for the question Julia raised about how do I see the situation today. That liberal multiculturalism, I'm sorry, got interrupted, no? Liberal multiculturalism is a form of white supremacy managing of differences. You have two versions in the USA. You have the old-fashioned way of white supremacy, that is the American apartheid, Jim Crow, which Trump and his folks represent, and they want to go to back to the good old days. Let's make white America great again. This is their slogan. And then you have the new forms of apartheid that is the liberal multicultural model. And the liberal multicultural model love to use this term diversity because it's about giving a multicultural face to white supremacy. For example, you look at the Bush, this is beyond Democrat Republican. You look at the Bush administration, or you look at the Obama administration, or you look at the Clinton administration, or you look back then at the Reagan administration. After the civil rights movement, liberal multiculturalism, and once the old fashion of white supremacy was defeated, liberal multiculturalism came to be the new form of white supremacy with new forms of apartheid. So we moved from apartheid to neo-apartheid, new forms of apartheid that are prison industrial complex, militarizing the border, policing communities. I mean, you go over the list of the forms of apartheid live in the USA today, and there are new forms emerging after the demise of Jim Crow and the old-fashioned way of American apartheid. So these forms of apartheid today are covered up with a multicultural face of the white supremacy state. So you have, for example, a Black Secretary of State giving the face of the invasion of Iraq, okay? Or you have a Latino Secretary of Justice passing the laws of torture in Abu Ghraib. Or you have brown face, black face in the white supremacist administration. You could even have a black president, you know, and the state, the black president is in the White House. The house is still white. The house haven't changed color. So the structures of the state haven't changed. We're talking about a white supremacist state that was formed out of the history of white supremacy. So that haven't changed. So liberal multiculturalism comes in and start talking about diversity without social justice. So now you incorporate tokens, a few faces of Black and brown people in the administration of the American empire, but the people that they represent, they still live in with the same oppressions. They haven't been emancipated or liberated from the oppression they've been living inside the American empire. So this is a very problematic solution to these questions of racial, patriarchal, colonial, imperial domination, because the people who are the victims of this process are in the same place. They just take a token, one person, make it honorary white, put them in the administration, and now you have a vice president that is a woman of color in the US today. But then when you look at the policies of the state, when you look at how they are killing every week, a Latino or a Black person is killed at the hands of the police with full impunity. And we have seen the videos all over the place. It's been happening for 300 years, these killings almost every day in this country. The difference is that now there's something called iPhones, that people take the video and suddenly we can see what really happened. And we can contrast the version of the police with what really happened. And that's the only thing. But still, when you go to the courts, even with the video showing that it was an abusive killing of a human being, this police comes acquitted, which show you how racist is the criminal justice system in the USA. But it's not only USA. You could see it in Europe today. Look at the internment prisons that they have for immigrants in Europe today, and the foreigners law of the European Union. It's terrible. It's it's a system of, you know, of violence that is, you know, is dramatic, you know, and all the people dying in the Mediterranean have become a cemetery. The Mediterranean is a cemetery today. You know, all these people, look at Europe participate with US empire of the destruction of Libya, of the destruction of Syria, of the destruction of Iraq. And then suddenly you have these refugees coming. And now you say, oh, we don't have anything to do with the refugees. I'm sorry, you destroy those countries. You participated of those invasions. And now don't complain. You see the people running away from these places and coming, trying to enter somewhere else, including Europe. And now don't wash your hands as if it had nothing to do with you. I'm sorry. The policies of the European Union were complicit, and not only complicit, in some cases even actively, in the case of Libya, participating of the devastation, destruction of these countries, just because they want oil, because Europe doesn't have oil. You know, now they're going after oil and destroying people and countries. And now you have millions of refugees. And now you don't want to take responsibility. Now you want to say, oh, you should go back home. I have nothing to do with your problems or your war. I'm sorry. The West is completely responsible for those wars, and you cannot now wash your hands. I mean, I'm sorry to say this, but this is the reality. So this is why all this thing about diversity and things like that, I find it very problematic, because what we need is social justice. We don't need diversity, we need social justice. We need to stop structural racism. We need to stop all these structures of domination that we've been talking about here. Anyway.
Well, so we should rather do away with the zones than trying to belong to the zones, right? As social movements, then. That was one of the questions.
Definitely. Julia, do you want to finish your comment? Because then I would like just to wrap up, because we have 1 minute left.
No, just I think I'm again grateful for this stimulation of mind and the very many helpful concepts and ideas you brought to it. I think we all need to read up more. I hope we also save the chat and you can send it to me and Ramon, because there were some questions I think that are worth replying to, since now we talked so much and the audience couldn't. That we, I think, keep on thinking about how also these structures continue to organize inequalities in the Mediterranean and elsewhere, and in the White House and everywhere.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ramon and Julia, for taking your time and for putting so much effort into this really brilliant presentation and comment. I just would like to use this very short opportunity of 1 minute left to announce our next session, which will take place on February 26th, and we'll be listening to two presenters, Katarzyna Brzezinova from Prague and Luisi Pedrosa from Mexico City, who will present and discuss the topic Mexico and the United States, Frontierization and Migration Policies. And Mario, would you like to add something about the last two sessions of this series?
Yes, very quickly. Thank you, Albert. On 26th March, also a Friday, we will have a session on public transport and the circulation of experts and knowledge between the Americas and Europe. And our presenters will be Andra Cheston, who is Assistant Professor of History at Washington State University, Vancouver. And we will have from South America, Dan Zunino Singh. He's a sociologist and historian of culture, cities, and mobilities, and is a research fellow at the Center for Intellectual History at the University of Quilmes in Argentina. And we will close our series on the last day of April with a session on aviation, national identities, and hemispheric relations in the Americas. And on that day, we will have Melina Piglia, a historian and lecturer at the Universidad Nacional Mar del Plata, also from Argentina, Leonie Schuster, who has got her PhD from the Freie Universität Berlin and is now working at the University of Kiel in Germany, and Peter Soland, Assistant Professor of History at Southeast Missouri State University. And I would also like to thank you, Ramon, for your wonderful lecture, you, Julia, for your insightful comment, and also Heike Friedman for technical assistance, and all people in the audience for participating and putting your questions. And I hope to see you in the next sessions.